Principle 25. Only God can change people, so you are not and cannot be responsible for changing them. You are accountable to God solely for your own deeds. You know why a lot of us get dragged down? Is because we want our parents to change and they don't change. We want our wife or our husband to change and they don't change. And we somehow feel obligated to get them to change. And if they don't change, it's somehow at least part of it is our fault. Let's take a look at Ezekiel 18. In Ezekiel, God says something that's very strange as compared to the modern world's thinking about our lives. In that chapter, he starts out by, in the second verse, chapter 18, verse 2, God says, "What do you mean by using this proverb concerning the land of Israel? The fathers eat the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge." You know, our modern day education says exactly that. When the children are bad, it must be because the parents are bad. And or it's something that they have done. Must be. And if the children are really bad, the people who are going to blame is the parents. God says, get rid of that proverb. That's your proverb, Israel. The fathers eat the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. He says, as I live, declares the Lord God, you are surely not going to use this proverb in Israel anymore. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins will die. In other words, each person is individually responsible and cannot blame a parent or anybody else. And because apparently this proverb was going around rather wildly throughout all of Israel and completely, he then gives examples. He says, in verse 5, he says, but if a man is righteous and practices justice and righteousness. And then he talks all about this man who's practicing righteousness, and he ends up in verse 9 with this description of this man. If he walks in my statutes and my ordinances so as to deal faithfully, he is righteous and will surely live, declares the Lord. He's going to be rewarded. But notice the next verse. Then he may have a violent son. In spite of the fact that he's good, he may have a violent son. And this son does everything vile. I mean, he puts idols up in the mountains. He lends money at interest. He murders people. He commits robbery. He does all these things. And in verse 13, he says he lends money and interest and takes increase. Will he live? He will not live. He has committed all these abominations. He will surely be put to death. His blood will be upon his own head. Now, look at the next son. In verse 14, here's this terrible person has a son. Verse 14, now behold, he has a son who has observed all his father's sins. He's watched them commit these sins. And observing does not do likewise. Does not do likewise. Why? Because God in his sovereignty deals with each person individually. Just because my parents are drunkards does not mean I'm going to turn out to be a drunkard. Just because I grow up in the slums and I have all of this around me that is trying to pull me down does not mean that's the way I'm going to go. Now, that is different from the way the world looks at it. Because the world is often saying, if I have problems, it's got to be somebody else's fault, what they did to me. God says, no, that's not true. He sums all of this up, and he says in verse 20, the person who sins will die. The son will not bear the punishment of the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. Nobody, not my parents, nobody can interfere with my relationship with the Lord, cannot interfere with my contentment, cannot interfere with my joy in him, cannot drag me down in any way, even if they're my parents. Now, you know what? That frees up a lot of people who've been under the bondage, believing somehow that they're responsible for somebody else's life.